When you're home alone, are you really alone? The shadows seem to deepen, stretching out like grasping claws from the corners of your vision. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside your window sends a shiver down your spine. This tale begins on a stormy night in a secluded farmhouse. Imagine the scene: torrential rain lashing against the old warped wood, wind howling through the gaps in the window frames, and the only source of light, a single flickering lantern casting dancing shadows on the worn floral wallpaper. Our protagonist, a young woman named Sarah, huddled deeper into her worn armchair, desperately trying to lose herself in the pages of a well-thumbed novel. But the storm raged on, its fury seeming to mirror the growing unease in Sarah's heart. Every gust of wind that rattled the shutters, every crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the farmhouse, sent a jolt of fear through her. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just the storm, but deep down, a primal instinct whispered warnings of unseen danger. Then, she heard it. A noise, faint at first, almost lost in the cacophony of the storm. A soft, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere upstairs. Her blood ran cold. The farmhouse was old, its bones creaking and groaning with every gust of wind. But this was different. This was deliberate. Heart-pounding, Sarah slowly rose from her chair, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to writhe and deepen in the flickering lantern light. She listened intently, her breath catching in her throat as the thumping sound came again, clearer this time, accompanied by the distinct sound of heavy footsteps pacing across the old wooden floorboards above her. Fear, raw and consuming, threatened to paralyze her, but Sarah, armed with a fireplace poker and fueled by a desperate need to protect herself, began her terrifying ascent up the creaking staircase. Each step was an agonizing eternity, the darkness pressing in on her, the storm outside a raging symphony of chaos that mirrored the turmoil within her. As she reached the top of the stairs, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence hung in the air, broken only by the frantic pounding of Sarah's heart. She crept down the hallway, each room she passed an abyss of inky blackness that seemed to pulse with unseen menace. Finally she reached the source of the noise, the old guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and a sliver of pale moonlight from the window cast an eerie glow on the dusty floorboards. Sarah took a deep breath, her grip tightening on the fireplace poker, and with a silent prayer on her lips, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. The furniture, draped in white sheets, loomed like ghostly apparitions in the darkness. The window, she noticed with a growing sense of dread, was wide open, the wind whipping the curtains into a frenzy. But there was no sign of an intruder, no explanation for the footsteps, the thumping sounds that had sent her heart racing just moments ago. Suddenly a gust of wind slammed the door shut with a resounding boom. Sarah whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. She fumbled for the doorknob, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. Our next story takes us to a quiet suburb where everything seemed normal until one night. Emily and David were the epitome of the perfect suburban couple. A beautiful home on a tree-lined street, a friendly golden retriever named Buddy, and dreams of starting a family. Life was good, predictable, safe. But that predictability was about to be shattered, their sense of security shaken to its core. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A series of small, unexplainable occurrences that, at first, they dismissed as mere coincidence. A glass of water inexplicably shattering on the kitchen counter, Buddy barking incessantly at seemingly nothing in the dead of night. The unsettling feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. Then, things escalated. One evening, while preparing dinner, Emily swore she saw a fleeting figure dart across the hallway, a shadow that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. When she mentioned it to David, he dismissed it as her imagination, but Emily couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Their once peaceful home began to feel oppressive, shrouded in an invisible cloak of dread. Sleep became a distant memory, replaced by a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside their bedroom window sent shivers down their spines. One night Emily awoke with a start. her heart pounding in her chest. She had that unsettling feeling again, the feeling of being watched, but this time, it was more intense, more palpable. She turned to see if David was awake, but he was sound asleep beside her, his breathing slow and even. As she lay there, paralyzed by fear, she heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from the darkness beside her bed. It was too low to discern any words, but the tone was unmistakable, a chilling mix of malice and amusement. Emily bolted upright in bed, her eyes frantically searching the darkness, but there was nothing there. She could still feel the lingering presence, though, cold and menacing, like an icy hand closing around her heart. From that night forward, the occurrences became more frequent, more brazen. The final tale is perhaps the most chilling, set in an old apartment building with a dark past. Imagine a sprawling labyrinth of dimly lit hallways, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and forgotten tragedies. This is where we meet our protagonist, a young aspiring artist named Ben, who, lured by the cheap rent and the building's bohemian charm, unwittingly moved into apartment 5B, oblivious to the horrors that awaited him. From the moment he crossed the threshold, Ben couldn't shake off a feeling of unease. The apartment, though sparsely furnished, seemed to pulsate with a strange energy, a palpable darkness that clung to the very walls. There were whispers among the other tenants, hushed tones and knowing glances that hinted at a troubled history. But whenever Ben inquired, he was met with evasive answers and uncomfortable silences. As days turned into nights, Ben began to experience a series of unsettling events. He would hear strange noises at night, disembodied whispers, the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the floor above him, blood-curdling screams that seemed to echo from the depths of the building itself. He dismissed them at first, attributing them to his imagination or the building's aging infrastructure. Then, the nightmares began. Vivid, terrifying dreams that left him drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. In these nightmares, he would see fleeting glimpses of a shadowy figure lurking in the corners of his apartment, its eyes burning with an unholy light. One night, as Ben lay in bed, desperately trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had become his constant companion, he felt a cold spot settle over him. It was as if an icy hand had reached out from the darkness and wrapped itself around his heart. He gasped for air, his body paralyzed by fear as he felt an unseen presence enter the room. He opened his eyes, but the room was shrouded in darkness. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of his heart echoing in the silence. Just when he thought he could take no more, he saw it. A faint ethereal glow emanating from the corner of the room. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, he realized with growing horror that the glow was coming from a figure standing at the foot of his bed. It was tall and skeletal, its form shifting and shimmering like heat haze. It had no discernible features, just two glowing red eyes that seemed to bore into his very soul. Ben wanted to scream, to run, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of an unseen terror that threatened to consume him. The figure took a step closer, its silence somehow more terrifying than any scream. As the entity reached out a long, skeletal hand towards him, Ben squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself for the inevitable. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the tales of Sarah, Emily, David, and Ben. The world is full of shadows, and sometimes those shadows whisper back. Sleep tight and remember you might not be as alone as you think.